Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 8 of the Superman on Film podcast. Welcome to the show. Right now, I want to start things off with, of course, the countdown. We are currently 45 weeks away from James Gunn's Superman. 45 weeks until we get to see the Man of Steel soar across big screens again. So right now, let's go ahead and dive directly into our Superman on Film update for this week. So the update is minimal because once again, there is not any new big headline. There hasn't been a major casting. James Gunn hasn't gone out and handled any new interviews. So right now, the only news we have are some comments that he's made over on social media of late. And I think they're comments that are rather important. I think they're comments that are going to instill a little more confidence in this project, in the DCU as a whole. And I think it just speaks to the level of care and the attention to detail that are going into this movie and into this new DC franchise that we hope launches in earnest this December to much success and much fanfare. So one of the things that came up was, Superman recently wrapped and they entered the post-production stage of things. And for those people like myself who've been following, movie news for basically ever, we're very much used to hearing about reshoots, and we're always told how basically run-of-the-mill they are. Even the biggest films in the world, the most beloved films in the world, have had to enter some sort of reshoot phase during post-production. Because in post, in the editing bay, is where the director and the editors tend to find issues. Things where we thought this scene was great that day and we wrapped, but as it turns out, the lighting was a little off, or this character saying this line this way seemed to imply something a little weird, and now we're no longer building to something like that, so we got to go back and change it. There's always kinds of little minor technical things that have to get fixed, right? Then sometimes there are huge things that have to get fixed, right? We've heard of movies where it's like, now we're going to add a whole subplot, or now we're going to change the third act, or now we've had sweeping changes in reshoots, Justice League. But when it comes to, this movie, apparently for James Gunn's Superman, we don't have to anticipate much of any reshoots if James Gunn is to be believed. Because over on Threads, you see, he was asked about visual effects, and his answer there really paints a picture about, again, the level of preparation that goes into this. So he was asked, and I have to move this banner out of the way. Yeah, he was asked, what's your method for not doing a lot of reshoots? I'm curious. And he said, 1, over prepare. 2, don't start ever. That's not a good idea. But don't start shooting until I have a finished script my whole team is happy with. 3, hire actors and department heads I know can do their jobs. 4, surround myself with people who will challenge me and not just yes sir everything. 5, ask myself daily, are there any small imperfections in the script or what we're shooting that might end up feeling like huge imperfections when we cut the film together? And then I do 1 and 2 again. That's step 6. So that's how he intends to avoid doing, needing to do reshoots, where he also revealed that he's only done 1 day of reshoots across his final 2 films, his last 2 films, which were Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and The Suicide Squad. So he's not just saying that this is his approach, he apparently is backing it up. This approach has served him so well that across 2 huge blockbuster movies from 2 huge, different, massive Hollywood studios, he's only had 1 day of reshoots across both productions. And a big part of that also, there's the preparation, but then his answer here about VFX that came later on was even more revealing about the level of preparation here. So he said, if you do some research, you'll see my films have always taken a different approach, and I've always given my VFX artist collaborators time to do their jobs properly and the respect they deserve. And the quality of the VFX in those films is uniformly great because of it. and because my friends at Weta and Framestore and ILM and more are amazingly talented. This is why we wrapped Superman a year before release, and why they've been hard at work on many shots for months before that. This is why we start heartily editing during the shoot. It's why I prepare so vigorously and why we only shoot finished scripts. And Supergirl, which I'm not directing, is being handled the same way. I can't praise the VFX artists that help us create magic enough. So think about that for a little bit. You know, we noticed, right, that the film wrapped a full year early. That is a long time for post-production and for promotion. You know, that is probably a longer than usual time to wrap your film and then have it released. But to have him explain it this way, that it was literally, this was done on purpose to make sure that the artists had all the time they were going to need to handle all of the countless VFX shots that any proper Superman story is going to need, right? So, you know, when you hear about this level of care being taken, when you hear that it's also being applied to Supergirl, which he isn't directing, it gives you a sense that DC Studios has its priorities straight. Because this may shock you, but there are lots of major movies that enter production without a finished script. There are lots of major motion pictures where the VFX artists are worked to the bone and not paid nearly enough for their time, and they have to create magic in a matter of months for these huge tentpole films, and then all of us fans go and chew them out for it. We love to point out when effects look crappy and when things look plastic and when things look like a PlayStation cutscene, right? But we don't realize that most of the time that's not the artist's fault. It tends to be from a lack of preparation, and an overabundance of last-second changes, leading to the artist having to work and be overburdened in just the months heading up to release trying to make something look good. And it's funny because reading these comments from Gunn makes me realize, you know, I went back and I was thinking more about the effects in his movies, and I'm coming to think like they were always the best looking movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you go and look, there's lots of CG and there's lots of trippy visuals, and yet nothing looks downright fake. Nothing looks rubbery. Nothing looks like, uncanny valley. That's totally bogus, and now you've pulled me out of the reality of this scene. You know, so like I never really even thought of that, right? Because in the other Marvel movies, there are times where the effects has been jarring. There have been times where you're like, this is a little dodgy, but never on a Gunn movie. And the effects also looked phenomenal in the Suicide Squad. Like everything has a level of photorealism and truthfulness to the character or the element that it is trying to portray on the screen. So, you know, I wanted to put that out there as part of this week's Superman on Film update, because it really seems like finally our DC characters have someone in charge who's going to make sure that they put their best foot forward. That's going to make sure that each one of these movies, each one of these projects is in as good a shape as possible before we get to see it. And listen, that may sound like, duh, like, isn't that what everyone wants to do? But not really. You know, if you look around at different studios' approaches to doing shared universes, if you look at other studios' approaches to trying to, you know, get maximum returns on their IP, you'll see a lot of half-baked films. A lot of things where you're like, wow, how did this ever make it past the brainstorming stage? You know, who looked at this script or who looked at this concept and thought, yes, let's spend $185 million making this, and then we'll just reap all the rewards. You know, there's lots of things like that, Sony and Universal and even DC before this new regime took place, where it was just half-baked and half-cocked and half just poorly planned, with movies entering production while the movies that precede them haven't come out yet, so we don't even know if people like this direction, but we're already making the sequel for it. You know, just bizarre choices have been made a lot in the last 10 to 15 years of superhero cinema and in blockbuster filmmaking. And if he's able to stick to his word, it seems like we're going to be able to avoid a lot of that with the DC Studios output and with what hopefully the DCU ends up being. So that basically covers the Superman on film update for this week. And now it's time to get into this week's topic, which again was voted on. I put the poll up right on time this past Wednesday over at Superman on Film on the X account, the Twitter account. And here's your reminder. Again, you could find me over on Threads as well as Superman on Film. You could find me on Instagram and Superman on Film, and also over on Facebook. So on all the different social apps, go ahead and find Superman on Film and be sure to follow and subscribe and do all the good things. All right, will you? But okay, so on Wednesday, I threw up 4 topics and you all voted, and the topic that won was the biggest concerns for James Gunn's Superman. It seems some of you are out there worried. There is still a fair amount of skepticism and concern about this whole new venture that we're going on with the launching of DC Studios and the beginning of the DCU, after DC has been in great trouble in pop culture's eyes for many, many years now, with a very schizophrenic output and with projects that are just like, some are great, some are okay, some are crap. None of it seems to be building towards any sort of big moment that we should all be paying attention to. It's been a mess for a while. And even with a fresh coat of paint on things, even with a new boss, even with a lot of the bureaucracy now cut out of the process and no more film executives passing along terrible ideas and changing movies into something that they really shouldn't be, there are concerns. And I know here on this show, I've been accused of being a gun glazer and a gun fanboy and all this kind of stuff. People think I'm just a little overly optimistic. And, so I think it bears sharing, it bears discussing what my concerns are, as well as the concerns that I see out there. Because, I'm out there engaging in these conversations about Superman on Film every day. I'm a little bit of a maniac, but every day for years and years and years, I'm out there starting conversations and seeing the replies. I'm lurking on other people's conversations. I'm constantly just seeing what is the temperature. I'm taking the temperature of how people feel about this project and how, this, as things shape up, are we getting more confident? Are people getting more nervous? And the good news is I'm noticing that the closer we get, and we're still 45 weeks away, but it feels like, the more time passes, the more the optimism grows. When this was first announced in October of 2022 that DC Studios had been formed and that James Gunn was, going to take over. And then in the months ahead, we found out that, he was getting rid of Henry Cavill and this was going to be a hard reboot and all that. I would say things were, the majority of the response was negative. The majority of the response was, what are they doing? This can't be. How can you reboot our favorites? Yada, yada, yada. But I feel like with each passing week, I'm seeing more and more optimism. And I'm seeing more and more hope for this project. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some things to be worried about. So what I'm going to start with first is I'm going to recap real quick the 2 concerns that I have mentioned. I brought them up back on episode 3 of this show. If you have not checked out episode 3, I strongly suggest you do. I think you should go and check out all of them. We're only 8 episodes in. This is a new series. And, I think you should be all caught up if you're going to be watching Superman on Film or listening to this show. But I digress. Back on episode 3, I mentioned that one of my top concerns was this idea of, can James Gunn play it straight? Because again, this is a director, this is a writer who tends to take a very sort of subversive look at things. He always has kind of like the outsider's perspective on stuff. You could see it in his writing, and that's why he enjoys a lot more of the oddball, quirky characters who aren't necessarily the most well-liked or the most on the surface likable. But you find out later how likable they are. You know, he tends to kind of approach things that way, and it kind of gives you an insight into his mind frame. You know, if you listen to some of his stories about being that awkward kid at 11 who didn't want to go to school and just wanted to read and write comic books, who had trouble connecting with others and advancing in his studies and all that kind of stuff, like, you know, you realize that James is someone who always grew up feeling like he was a little bit of an outsider, a little different from everyone else. And almost all of his movies reflect this like quirky, outsiders, subversive perspective on life. And, you know, he's almost always able to get a lot of emotion out of it, and he ends up making you care about these wacky characters that you wouldn't have ordinarily paid any attention to. So he tends to succeed after a while, but he tends to always come at it from a place that's a little more, you know, sarcastic and clever and witty, and it beats around the bush. But then when the big moment arrives, you're like, oh, that was the point of this. I get it. But meanwhile, a Superman story isn't supposed to be subversive. You know, a Superman story isn't supposed to be sarcastic or cynical or kind of goofy or any of that stuff. You know, a Superman film can have humor, can have ample amounts of comedic moments and charm and light-hearted touches here and there, but it has to feel heartfelt. It has to feel sincere. It has to tug at your heartstrings more than just once or twice throughout the movie. You know, so my big concern right off the top when I heard he was being, you know, when he was going to be the man directing the project, my big concern was, can he play it straight? Can he give us a straightforward, sincere, true blue, good guy versus bad guy story of heroism, where there's, you know, all the love and hope and optimism that we hope from a Superman movie, that we hope to get from a Superman movie. So that remains a concern. I know he can do it. There are scenes in many of his movies that feel like, oh, okay, this is the tone, but then that scene gets followed up by, you know, a bunch of wacky stuff afterward that makes you go, huh? You know? So again, can he play it straight? That's a question that we're going to have to wait and see, you know? And my other big concern was, will the score matter? You know, because he hired John Murphy. He's very high on John Murphy. He's worked with John Murphy on a couple of films, but I have this issue where I couldn't hum you a single bar of anything John Murphy composed for any of those films. Because in James Gunn's movies, it always has kind of felt like the score is on the back burner. You know, he's big on needle drop moments. He's big on using real songs, the songs that inspired him to write a particular scene, the songs that seem to inform why he wrote this movie at all. You know, he loves music. Music is central to his storytelling style, and I appreciate the hell out of that. But the score that's itself never seems to be paramount when it comes to his movies. You know, I couldn't hum you the Guardians of the Galaxy theme. There probably is one, but I don't know it. You know what I mean? I couldn't hum for you what the Suicide Squad's theme was, but you know, even Peacemaker, right? What's the big piece of music from Peacemaker? It's a heavy metal, hair metal song. You know what I mean? In all of his projects, it's the songs that get attention and get remembered, but not the score. Not the symphonic themes connected to each character and how they bring extra pathos and extra emotion to the scenes. And then in the big climax, when you hear the hero's motif played at a grand level, you get all the goosebumps. Yeah, like that's the kind of stuff DC movies have always done. DC films have always placed a priority on the score and the emotion of the score, whereas Marvel movies, it's always kind of felt more like temp score that made it into the final cut. Very rarely, unless it was Alan Silvestri and even Danny Elfman's work on Age of Ultron and beyond, like very few composers have made anything that stands out in any way, shape, or form in the MCU. And he's bringing his MCU composer to the DCU. So that's why, you know, I have this concern. I need, you know, for me, no Superman film is complete without an epic score to back it up. And we've been lucky so far. We had the amazing John Williams, and we've had the amazing Hans Zimmer, and we've had some really good work from composers in between, taking their themes and adjusting them. Junkie XL kept on Hans Zimmer's work after Man of Steel, and a whole load of different composers carried on John Williams' work after Superman the movie. I think the best example was John Ottman, the director/composer for Superman Returns. I think he did a wonderful job of taking Williams' motifs, adding his own, modernizing them, removing some of the sap level from a little of it. Like John Ottman, I think he deserves an extra shout out as well. But when it comes to Superman on film, you gotta have an epic score and a theme that people walk away humming. And even Man of Steel, I know we don't talk about it that often because it didn't exactly replace the Williams theme, but we all have that da-da, da-da, da-da. Like, we all know the piano parts for Man of Steel, and we can all remember those little melodies that Hans Zimmer created. It's like, we need to make sure that happens again. I don't want forgettable, innocuous, vanilla scoring for a Superman movie. So I hope John Murphy is able to bring it. I've listened to some of his stuff in the last few weeks from other movies he scored, and, he's got the goods. He seems to be able to cover all the full ranges of sounds you'd want. I like that he has a little bit of the Hans Zimmer touch too, where he's not afraid to incorporate unconventional instruments into the orchestra. So you'll hear guitar and you'll hear synthesizers. You'll hear other sounds mixed in with the strings and the horn. And I like that kind of stuff. It's not just pure orchestral. So I like John Murphy's range of sounds, and I think he's got the talent. But let's see what happens. And it is kind of funny, too. I'm just realizing now all these Johns who have scored Superman. John Williams, John Ottman, and now John Murphy. Very interesting. But yeah, so those were my two concerns that I mentioned earlier on. And I also kind of want to go into another one of my concerns before I get to some of the concerns I've seen some of you all have, which is there's one quote that actually worries me from James Gunn. I know that may shock you because I'm always talking about how all this guy does is drop green flags out of his mouth. Rather than make me worried, he makes me excited with everything he says. Everything is just green flag. Green means go. Let's do this. Thank you, James. But this week I came across, I've seen it before. But I read a quote from him that actually put like a knot in my stomach. Okay. And I think it's a quote that like I've avoided referencing. It's a quote that I've avoided tweeting out. I love finding old things he said that have instilled confidence and sharing it out there if you follow me on any of the socials. But this one, it makes me a little nervous, okay? And it takes us all the way back to March of 2023 when, after a few months of revealing that he had written this Superman script and rumors that he was trying to, he was meeting with directors to possibly, who could direct it, with Ben Affleck being a rumor and other people possibly being in the running. In March of 2023 is when he announced that he is doing it. And in that statement, it concludes in a way that makes me feel a little bit like he might have been forced to direct this movie. Like he almost kind of had his hand pushed and kind of given an ultimatum where like, you've got to direct this movie because we've given you DC Studios. We've given you all of this autonomy. So since this entire universe is on your shoulders, you need to be the one who sets the tone. You need to be the one who makes the first movie and shows the world what this new venture is. I get that sense, but let me read you the quote so you could see, what made me nervous. All right. So in the middle of the quote, he starts talking about how he had turned it down initially. He says, "It has been a long road to this point. I was offered Superman years ago. I initially said no because I didn't have a way in that felt unique and fun and emotional that gave Superman the dignity he deserved. Then, a bit less than a year ago, I saw a way in many ways centering around Superman's heritage, how both his aristocratic Kryptonian parents and his Kansas farmer parents inform who he is and the choices he makes. So I chose to finally take on writing the script. But I was hesitant to direct, despite the constant pestering by Peter Safran and others to commit. Sorry, Peter. Just because I write something doesn't mean I feel it in my bones, visually and emotionally, enough to spend over 2 years directing it, especially not something of this magnitude. But the long and short of it is, I love this script, and I'm incredibly excited as we begin this journey, up, and away. So I'm going to focus in on those final 2 parts, okay? Because this is where I get anxious. Because he says, again, just because I write something doesn't mean I feel it in my bones, visually and emotionally, especially not something of this magnitude. But the long and short of it is, I love this script, and I'm incredibly excited as we begin this journey. So the reason that makes me nervous is he doesn't claim now that this script does make him feel those things. He's not saying this script, he now does feel it in his bones visually and emotionally, and that, that he does want to spend 2 years of his life directing it. He just basically says, but long story short, it's a good script, and this is going to be a good time. So, where was the saying, where was him sharing the turning point? At some point, if he took the job, in theory, the job became something that he did feel in his bones. It did become something that he felt like, I have to direct this. But he doesn't mention that. And it makes you wonder, did that happen? Is he directing this because he had a day where after he read the final draft, he said, oh, no. I'm the only man for this job. This is a job for James Gunn. Or could he just either not find someone who wanted to direct it, or B, more likely, was told by Peter and then their boss, David Zaslav, that it's really got to be you. And if you want all the freedom and all the leeway that we're going to give you to do this stuff, you've got to be the one who sets the blueprint and creates the map for all of this with your movie. You got to pull off what Jon Favreau did with Iron Man. You have to pull off with Superman, and James Gunn, under that level of pressure and that's what made him decide to take it, because there's nothing in that quote that walks back that phrase. There's nothing in the quote that says he suddenly is excited to do this again. That this project suddenly became something that he simply had to do. It sounds more like he was convinced to do it. So with that in mind, I just have a little bit of a trepidation, because I don't like the idea that in his big first initial address as the director of Superman, he said that, just because he writes something doesn't mean he has to do it. And he didn't really want to do it, but everyone told him he should do it. So, okay, fine, I'll do it. That's how it comes off, So, and on top of that, we heard rumors at the time, too, that he was more locked in and stuff like The Authority, which, again, is more his speed. It's more his lane, whereas Superman is not traditionally his lane. So, again, he was convinced to do it. I hope he's excited to be doing it. I know he is. But it just, that quote was the first thing I've ever seen. And it's funny because it's one of his first, right? But it's one of the first quotes that when I've looked back on in hindsight made me go, was Gunn forced to do this movie? Will that have an impact? Will the lack of passion or personal connection to this character and this story be evident in the movie? It was something that I initially felt last March, and that I've tried to, basically ignore, as he has said a million other things that were positive. But, James, I hope that you're doing this because at some point you just felt like I'm the only man who can tell this story. This is my Superman story, and I'm ready to spend the next 2+ years bringing this story to life. I hope that happened, and it wasn't just everyone going, no, James, it has to be you, damn it. So, all right, the next one that I've been coming across is this idea of, will James Gunn's Superman overcorrect from the Snyderverse? You know, because the Snyderverse, the movies that Superman was involved in prior to this, you know, they suffered from this feeling from mass audiences that they were a little too dark, they were a little too edgy, they were trying too hard to be too grown up and too mature, and they were taking this mythology down a dark path that most fans really weren't interested in going down. And there's this concern that James Gunn's Superman could end up trying to be so the opposite of that it ends up just being totally, you know, trivial and pointless and silly and goofy and lighthearted and overly colorful to try to differentiate itself from Batman versus Superman and the other, you know, Superman films that have come out in the last, you know, several years. And, you know, it is an interesting concept, this idea of overcorrection, because Warner Brothers has already done it. We've seen overcorrections before. You know, if you look at the differences between Superman Returns and Man of Steel, it's not hard to see the overcorrection right there. What happened with with Superman Returns? Everyone said it lacked action. Superman needs to punch something. It needed more just like grit and intensity. And then we get Man of Steel, where now we have the grit and the intensity, and Superman punches a whole lot of things, and there's so much action. It's like an hour of watching Smallville and Metropolis be slowly destroyed. You know, like they totally went the opposite way. Like, oh, you thought Superman Returns was a little slow and boring and dull? Then we're going to give you an insane balls to the wall action spectacle with Man of Steel. And they overcorrected. And then even after that, right, when Man of Steel got some backlash for Superman not really focusing in on the collateral damage, on Superman not trying to get Zod away from Metropolis, then in BVS, Zack Snyder overcorrected. He's like, all right, fine. You don't think that Superman cared enough about humans? I'm going to make an entire movie where that's the perspective, where Bruce Wayne thinks that way about him. All right. Now we're going to put that idea on full display. And also, when they fight, it's going to be on an abandoned, empty island, so nobody can complain about collateral damage. And, you know, like you could see how, like, whoa, we went from one extreme in Man of Steel to another. And, you know, this idea of like trying to, you know, fix something. Sometimes you could try too hard to fix it. And there's a concern with the Snyder, you know, with James Gunn's Superman, where in his attempts to be different from the Snyderverse, will this just lack any bite? Will this be just, you know, a colorful, lighthearted romp? You know, so that is a concern some people have. I don't think it will be. You know, if you look at the Suicide Squad, I felt like the Suicide Squad kind of bridged the gap between the two concepts. You know, it had some of the darkness, some of the more serious, heady tones, and some of the more grown-up visuals. But it also had, you know, a sense of humor and a lightheartedness and a heart to the characters that kind of made it, in my mind, like a perfect sort of DC movie. I don't want this to be what Superman is like, but it showed that, like, he knows how to thread that needle. It wasn't exactly a colorful Guardians movie, but it also wasn't a dark, you know, edgy DCEU movie. It was something kind of right in between. So he's shown he could find that balance, but it still stands to reason where as this film starts getting promoted, as we start seeing clips from it, are we going to start noticing that he was trying way too hard to differentiate from what's come before, and he ended up making something that was childish and not worth it. I don't think it's going to happen, but it is a concern. Let's not overcorrect from the Snyderverse. Then, we know that he has a tendency to like the smaller, goofier characters in a particular comic book's mythology. He loves to bring out the wackiness. And when it comes to Superman, he's got some wackiness, right? He's got the Toy Man, and he's got Mr. Mixelpick. He's got some interesting, zany villains and supporting characters. And we know that James loves to mine the books for those kinds of characters. And, there's a concern that will he bring too much of the wackiness into Superman's world in his attempt to show this larger world that Superman has that we've dumbfoundingly never gotten to see on the big screen? Will he focus too much on these, C and D players of, these wacky side characters from the Superman mythology? And, again, we're going to have to see. The fact that the Guardians movies were filled with wacky side characters, but our focus was always still on the main story and what the main characters were going through. I think that speaks to that concern. I don't think the wacky stuff far outweighed the more important parts of the Guardians movies. But there were times, and it is, it's a fine line to walk. So we're going to have to see if he gets a little too cute with the types of characters he pulls out of the Superman mythology, and if fans are willing to accept some of these like wackier, more fantastical, magical villains, because it's not really what we've seen so far when it comes to Superman on the big screen. Another one is, there are so many heroes in the movie, right? We keep hearing about Hawkgirl and Guy Gardner and Mr. Terrific. We know that there's the Authority. We know that Supergirl is probably going to show up to set up her movie. We know that there might be Crypto in there somewhere. We know that this is a fully formed DC universe that we're going to be meeting in Superman. This isn't like they're going to slowly piece the universe together. No, when Superman arrives, there's already heroes here. And in this movie, he's already interacting with other heroes and several different kinds of potential villains for down the line. And if you're someone who's been following these movies for a while, you'll remember that there was great concern back in 2016. When we saw the trailer for Batman versus Superman, a lot of people got very nervous. We thought this was going to be Man of Steel 2. And we knew Batman was going to be in there, and they were going to find an interesting way to make them have a conflict that then resolves itself in time for them to team up in the third act. We all kind of knew that. But then the trailer started to reveal exactly how much more. And if you get to trailer 3, it was insane how much more was going to be in this movie. By the end of trailer 3, we knew that, okay, so this movie centers on Superman. It also seems to center a great deal on Batman. It seems to put in some serious legwork setting up Wonder Woman. Oh, look, there's the new Lex Luthor. Oh, look, there's Doomsday. Whoa. And then there's the title, Dawn of Justice, which heavily implied that there will be other Justice League members. And we started hearing teases, because the castings came out of Jason Momoa as Aquaman and Ray Fisher as Cyborg and Ezra Miller as the Flash. And suddenly everyone kind of realized all of these heroes are likely to show up in BVS. And what's going to happen here? They're going to overshadow Superman. And it's going to be a very kind of overstuffed, overly crowded narrative. How can we really put attention where it belongs, which is Superman, when there's all these other heroes and suddenly we're being pulled in all these different directions? So there was a lot of concern at the time. And in this particular instance, there is still concern because there's all these heroes, but I feel like it's not the same level of concern anymore, because in this particular case, it seems like this is definitely Superman's story. And the reason he's interacting with other heroes is part of the bigger picture, is part of showing that in this world, there are heroes who do it for profit. In this world, there are heroes who do it for popularity. There's heroes who work for the government. There's heroes who work for corporations. And he's going to have to be the thing that opposes them. He's going to have to be that one, the canary in the coal mine, where there's lots of different people with lots of different reasons for doing this, but Superman is the true hero who's ultimately going to rise up and inspire not just all these heroes one day, but also inspire all of humanity one day. So I feel like the overabundance of DC characters we're hearing so far, they may all have like a scene or two. It's mainly to just set up this juxtaposition of Superman versus all these other kinds of heroes that are out there. I don't think we're going to be getting full-on subplots with any of these heroes, where now we're going to be following Guy Gardner for a scene or two. And now we're going to look at this, I don't think any of that's happening. I think this is going to be a Superman movie through and through. And yes, there will be other heroes, but I don't think they're going to distract from our guy. But again, this is just a hunch. This is just a feeling. It's just a hope, really, if we're being honest, right? I have nothing to base this on, but I just have this hope that James Gunn is not going to make the mistake of burying the lead when it comes to Superman. He's got to be front and center. His scenes, his motivations, his priorities, his concerns, that has to be the crux of what this movie's about. I don't think we're going to be focusing a heck of a lot on all these other heroes. But again, it's a concern that bears sharing and bears repeating, because we have been here before with, is Superman going to get lost in the shuffle? And sadly, in Batman versus Superman, he was lost in the shuffle. At the end of the day, our concerns ended up being truthful. It ended up being right. Especially if you look at the theatrical cut as opposed to the ultimate cut, where the extra half hour really did add some more to Clark's scenes and give some more to Superman's motivations. Especially in the theatrical cut, though, he felt like kind of a bit player in his own movie. So I understand the concerns. I don't think it's going to happen again, because there's no other hero that is even meant to be a top line member of this story, right? In Batman versus Superman, look, they put Batman's name first. So that was the first clue that this sequel might not really be about Superman after all, and ultimately in that movie, they were focused so much on setting up the other movies, since they were already in production, that Superman didn't really get his time to shine. And when he finally got his time to shine, they killed him at the end of the movie. So at the end of the day, our concerns were valid back then. But here's just hoping that this time around, that concern will not be an issue. Then another concern about the movie is just the business of the movie. Will it succeed, and what happens if it doesn't? Us fans of this character and of these movies have really been through the ringer for years. We've been watching DC on film struggle mightily since 2016, where all of a sudden we started noticing that the goodwill towards the characters was starting to die, and that people were really just locking in on anything from the Batman IP, and that really anything DC related has been hit or miss, unless you're Aquaman, which was December of 2018, which was the last time a non-Batman character had a runaway hit movie from DC. That was December of 2018, okay? Almost 6 years ago, okay? The only movies that have had any real viable success, aside from Aquaman in December of 2018, have been two Elseworld movies. It's been The Batman and it's been Joker. Those are the only two movies that were runaway financial successes that had all the things working for it. It had critical acclaim, it had fan acclaim, and it made a bunch of money. Those are the only ones. Joker, The Batman, Aquaman, those are the only three since our terrible 2016 that have been just like straight wins. Oh, and Wonder Woman. I have to mention Wonder Woman in 2017. But like, really, it's been such a bumpy road. And if you look at everything since Aquaman, there's not a lot of faith in the DC brand right now. Nobody sees the DC logo at the start of the trailer and goes, oh, I'm going to be seeing this, whatever it is. For a while there, Marvel had that. I think they've lost it now. But for a while there, Marvel was able to just be like, hey, we're Marvel Studios, so you're going to like this. And a lot of us were like, yeah, I'm probably going to like this. And, just the brand itself sold you on some of their movies. DC needs to get to that place because right now they're not there at all. Right now, for the last 5-6 years, it has been feast or famine, and the only feasting has been if you're in the Batman world. So it's just, there is a concern that can this movie succeed with the audience faith in the brand basically being in the toilet? And we've seen what happens when these movies don't succeed. We've seen insane amounts of course correction. We've seen executives replaced. We've seen other directors flown in. We've seen sweeping rewrites. DC fans, we have a little bit of PTSD from these movies getting announced, getting made, then getting lambasted, then getting tweaked, and then getting, new bosses entirely. It has been an insane road if you're a fan of this universe and you're a fan of these characters for a while. So can James Gunn's Superman succeed? I think it all is going to depend on what the internal bar is for success. With Man of Steel, it made in the high 600s, and for some reason that was not considered successful enough by the people at Warner Brothers. And Batman vs. Superman made $873 million. But that wasn't considered successful enough for Warner Brothers. And after each of these, some baffling decisions were made that affected the rest of DC's output for years. So if this movie comes out and it doesn't hit some magic number, are we going to go through some crazy shuffle again? That's the big concern. And I think the bar should be what the Batman earned. The Batman earned around $750 million. It was there in the mid 700s. It was considered a success by the studio. They greenlit sequels and spin-off TV series. And I think that seems to be the sweet spot, the mid 700s. And I think if James Gunn's Superman can hit that, I think we're safe. I don't think anything bad happens to any of the future DC films. If this makes under 700, if it makes under 600, if it makes under 5, like other DC movies have made in the last few years, then things get a little dodgy. Because even though James Gunn and Peter Safran do not answer to Warner Brothers Pictures anymore, and they only have one boss, and that's David Zaslav, David Zaslav can make some rash calls. We've heard of some of his business decisions coming back to hurt Warner Brothers Discovery. And he's pissed off a lot of creators and he's pissed off a lot of producers. And, he can be a little bit erratic. So if Superman fails, you could see him suddenly going to DC Studios and either threatening to pull the plug or using whatever his boss privileges are to try to impose his will on future DC movies. So that is a concern. That will this movie make enough money and be received well enough to let James Gunn continue cooking? Or will it not hit some weird line that we don't know about that now makes them want to change things? But let's talk a little bit about what we think that weird line should even be. Because I keep saying that the Batman really should be the bar. That Matt Reeves' the Batman really should be where our expectations are at for James Gunn's Superman. And here's why. Because when Matt Reeves' Batman came out in 2021, you got to realize something. It had its own uphill battle to climb. Okay, in a span of only 9 years, the public had gotten to know this was going to be our third Batman, because in 2012 was when the Dark Knight Rises trilogy had wrapped. And remember, everyone loved that. Those movies all made a ton of money. They got tons of prestige. There was all this buzz around it. The Dark Knight trilogy was a very special time for DC on film. So people have very high feelings and high regard for Christian Bale's Batman and the work that Christopher Nolan did on those 3 movies. So they knew that Batman through 2012 Then in 2016, they met a second Batman that was unrelated. It was Ben Affleck, and he was connected to a couple of movies that were highly polarizing. And then the last that they had seen of Batman was in November of 2017 when the theatrical cut of Justice League had come out. And what happened in that? Last we saw from Batman, he was setting up the Hall of Justice. Remember? He was and chairs for 7 people. Like the whole thing where they were turning Wayne Manor into the Hall of Justice at the end of the theatrical cut of Justice League. And then in the teaser at the end of in the post-credit sequence, we see Deathstroke talking to Lex Luthor about forming the Legion of Doom, forming a league of their own. So for mass audiences who aren't necessarily following all these geeky ins and outs of what was going on with these projects and probably don't even care about the box office numbers, they just want to see these characters. For people who had seen Justice League and gave it a shot, the last thing that they saw of Batman at the end of 2017 was he's building a Justice League and he's going to be facing Deathstroke at some point, and there's some sort of team of bad guys that is being mounted. And then what happened after that? We went radio silent on all things Batman, and all of a sudden in 2020, the public starts getting teasers for a new Batman movie that is completely unrelated to the last 2 that we were talking about. All right. So this has nothing to do with the Bale Batman from a few years back. This has nothing to do with the Ben Affleck Batman from a couple years ago. Now is just an all new Batman in a take that looks like a 7 movie. The trailer kind of did the heavy lifting in terms of communicating that this is not related to anything you've seen before. This is a brand new take, and this is a different Batman. And with that uphill battle against it, with people having basically tuned out of DC by and large, the box office had gotten so sort of mediocre through 2021 that, you couldn't really call DC a successful brand anymore. And yet, when the Batman came out, it did well enough that it made almost 800 million, upwards of 700. I forget the exact figure, but it was an attractive enough number that the studio greenlit sequels and spin-offs, and bam, the Batman is now here to stay. And that's why I feel like that number is important, because just as the Batman had an uphill battle and still made it to those mid 700s, I think Superman is going to have an uphill battle and also make it to the mid 700s. Because if you look at James Gunn's track record too, the guy hasn't missed when it comes to, traditionally released mass superhero movies. People like to harp on how things went with his rated R, the Suicide Squad movie. But you got to remember, that was released at the same time on Max for free for all subscribers. They all got to witness, they all got to see the Suicide Squad for free. All right, so that's why the box office for that was, a little tepid, and it was also rated R, so it was never going to be a huge high earner like his Guardians movies. It was aimed squarely at adults, and it was always going to make a little less, and it ended up making a lot less because of Warner Max's decision at the time to basically, give it away for free. It was crazy. But if you look at his other traditional superhero releases, with Guardians 1, he made $773 million. And then with Guardians 2, it was 870. And with Guardians 3, it was like 846. So he has not gone below 770 with one of his movies. And these are movies that are about a talking raccoon and a walking tree and a bunch of characters that very few people grew up following. That very few people who, when they saw them on the poster, said, "Oh, we got to run and see this movie." James Gunn had to make people buy into this whole concept, because I know everyone likes to say, well, the Marvel brand did the heavy lifting here. People gave it a shot because of the Marvel brand. Yeah, maybe they gave the first one a shot because of the Marvel brand. And even that one made 773 million. But by the second one, they knew, they went to see the second one because they loved what they saw the first time and wanted more of it. So on the second one, you can't really blame the Marvel brand. It actually went up like $100 million more it earned. So in terms of James Gunn's track record of getting people to buy into these concepts, he's able to make people spend a lot of money on his movies. So based on his track record, based on the fact that the Batman was considered a success in the mid 700s and it also had its own uphill battle, I would like to just put out there that if James Gunn's Superman makes 750 million, we are in good hands. And can it do that? Can it do that? Yes. Yes, it does, but it's going to require a very large, very specific marketing campaign. The trailers is funny. They're going to have to go kind of the route that Man of Steel went. Because if you remember, Man of Steel, that was a big deal in 2013. That when they were promoting that film, this was going to be the very first time we got a Superman movie that was unrelated to Christopher Reeve. That was a brand new continuity, a brand new take on the character, a brand new lease on life. And the way that they communicated this to the audience, because remember, in 2013, the last time people had seen Batman was 7 years prior. And Superman Returns only made 400 million, and it was received rather tepidly. And that was people's last impression of Superman. So in 2013, for that film, for Man of Steel, the very first teaser relied heavily on letting you know who the creatives were. So one of the very first things you see on the screen is from director Zack Snyder of 300 and Watchmen. Then the very next thing with text is, and producer Christopher Nolan of the Dark Knight trilogy. Like, they went heavily on marketing. Look who's making this movie. Look how different it feels than anything you've seen before. Look at the epic projects that they've been a part of before. This is a brand new animal entirely. And that's how they marketed Man of Steel. And to their credit, Man of Steel made like 667 million. So it did end up improving on Superman Returns, and it created enough interest. And it's because the audience was trained. The audience was educated from the start. Ooh, this is new. This is different. And it comes from people we like, love, or trust already. And we're going to have to do the same thing with James Gunn's Superman. I guarantee you right now, that first teaser is going to push heavily on phrases like a brand new vision, a new start from visionary director James Gunn, creator of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. Like, you're going to see a lot of that in there, and it's smart. Because again, we want to make new audiences, or we want to make audiences in theaters that had checked out of DC and checked out of Superman suddenly lean forward in their chairs and go, really? So they're starting over again, and they got the Guardians guy to do it. This ought to be good. And they could even reference, an all new universe, like whatever. Like, they're going to have to find a way. And I think that this will be the plan with the new logo and new everything, that they are going to hit the point home that this is the start of something fresh, and it's coming from people you trust, and get ready, much like Man of Steel did. So with that in mind, Man of Steel was able to improve on Superman Returns with a significant marketing push. Wouldn't it be nice if James Gunn's Superman could improve on Man of Steel and surpass that 667 and get us into the mid 700s? I think we can do it. I don't think it is that far-fetched. And the final thing is just managing expectations. In my case, managing my own expectations. If you watch this show, I obsess about this stuff. And that I'm feeling sky-high hope and optimism when it comes to this movie. I think it's going to be great. But I also thought that about Superman Returns. I also thought that about Man of Steel towards the end there when they were, after trailer 3, I spent some time going, wait a minute, this is going to be an all-time Superman epic. Like that was how I was talking to my friends and family at the time. So as a fan, I do tend to put on the rose-tinted glasses. I do tend to walk in wanting to love it. Most Superman movies don't have to do too much convincing to get me to love them. And, in both cases, I was ready to fight you after Superman Returns and tell you that was a classic. How dare you not love it? And with Man of Steel, I mean, I may not have thought it was a classic, but I thought it was strong, and I didn't understand what a lot of the initial backlash was, and it took a few more viewings for me to kind of land on my own issues with it. But I walk in with a big open heart and big open arms. I want to love and embrace any new Superman movie that comes out because he just means that much to me. And so when it comes to James Gunn Superman, I just got to remind myself of that. Like, don't get overexcited for this. It's still just a movie. It's coming from a guy who, he takes it seriously. He's got the goods, but he's never made anything like the kind of Superman movie that you love. So take it easy. Let's see if he can actually do it, So managing expectations, I think, is something we're all going to have to do. And for those of us who have very low expectations, it might behoove us to move back up to an area of cautious optimism here. Because there are a lot of reasons to think this is going to work. There are a lot of reasons to think that there's so much thought and care, and the process itself has been revamped as such so much that this is going to succeed where other projects have failed. There is a lot of reason to think that. But if you're someone whose expectations are through the roof, listen, being a DC fan has taught me to lower my expectations because unfortunately, because of the nature of this brand and the way things have been handled for years, you just never know sometimes. So that is the final concern I wanted to mention, and that pretty much brings us to a close here on episode 8 of the Superman on Film podcast, which I just realized I recorded all in one take. It's been 52 minutes and 20 seconds of just me sitting here. Look at that. This was the first one that's been like that, so I'm kind of happy. But anyway, I digress. I actually have to go DJ a wedding now, so I'm glad that I was able to get all this in. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed episode 8 of the Superman on Film podcast. Be sure to like, rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends, join in on the countdown, vote on the polls on Wednesday over on X, follow me over on Threads and Twitter and Instagram and all that good stuff. And until next time, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up and away.